Hey there and welcome back. Ready to see what's making news today?
Lots going on, that's for sure.
We've got a packed show for you today, so let's jump right in.
Sounds good to me.
First up, some tense developments in the Caucasus region.
Yeah, things are getting pretty interesting there. The U.S. just slapped sanctions on Bidzina Ivanishvili, the big power broker in Georgia.
Right.
And they're accusing him and his party, Georgian Dream, of trying to, well, basically sabotage Georgia's chances of joining the EU and NATO.
So it's bigger than just one guy or one political party then.
Yeah,
We're talking about Georgia's whole relationship with both Russia and the West being at stake.
exactly. And
Hmm.
this is all happening at a really, really sensitive time.
How so?
Well, Georgia is already in a political crisis, remember? The recent elections were super controversial.
Oh, right, yeah.
And the outgoing president, Salome Zurabishvili, is refusing to leave office until they hold new elections.
Wow.
She's super pro-Western and sees what Georgian Dream is doing as pushing the country right into Russia's arms, basically.
Yeah, so you've got this internal power struggle going on, and then, like, looming in the background is Russia. That's a recipe for instability, wouldn't you say?
Totally. And it makes you wonder, how much is Russia actually pulling the strings here? And what does this mean for the security of the whole region, especially with the war in Ukraine still raging?
Good point. And speaking of that war, we can't ignore the fact that North Korea is getting more deeply involved,
Definitely.
which is a pretty worrying development.
Yeah, it is. This alliance between Russia and North Korea is something that could have a ripple effect way beyond Ukraine.
No kidding.
The news of a captured North Korean soldier dying from his injuries really drives home the human cost of this whole thing.
It's awful. And it's not just an isolated incident either. The White House estimates that in just the last week alone, something like 1,000 North Korean troops have been killed or wounded in Ukraine.
Wow, that's a lot.
It really makes you wonder about the level of desperation on both sides. Russia needing manpower, and North Korea may be seeing this as a way to get some, real-world combat experience for their military, even if it comes at a huge cost.
It's a gamble for both of them, that's for sure. Now, shifting gears a little bit, let's turn our attention to a region that's been grappling with conflict for over a decade, Syria.
Right.
The effects of the Syrian civil war are still being felt today in many different ways.
Yeah, and even though Assad fell from power back in 2011, the trauma from his regime is something that people are still living with. Take the story of Duna Haj Ahmed, for example. She's a Syrian refugee now living in London, and she only recently learned the full truth about what her husband, Abdullah al-Nawfal, went through in one of Assad's most notorious prisons, Al-Khatib.
It's chilling, isn't it? Al-Khatib is infamous for its brutality. And Abdullah's account of what he experienced there, the arbitrary arrest, the solitary confinement, the constant threat of torture is just heartbreaking.
It's mind-blowing to think that it took the fall of Assad for Abdullah to finally feel safe enough to share his story, even with his own wife.
Yeah.
The weight of carrying a secret like that for so long, it's hard to fathom.
And tragically, Abdullah's story is not unique. The trial of Anwar Reslan in Germany a few years back really pulled back the curtain on the systematic torture that was happening in Syrian prisons under Assad.
Right.
We're talking about tens of thousands killed, and countless others subjected to unimaginable horrors.
It's difficult to grasp that this was happening just a few years ago.
I know.
And as if the situation in Syria itself wasn't complex enough, it's also got these regional implications, like we're seeing with the recent Houthi missile attacks on Israel.
Right. The Houthis, who control northwestern Yemen, have been launching missiles and drones at Israel. And in response, Israel has been carrying out airstrikes on targets in Yemen. It's a dangerous escalation.
For sure.
And the international community is understandably concerned, especially given the dire humanitarian situation in Yemen.
It's a powder keg, for sure. The Houthis are saying they won't stop the attacks until Israel stops what they call genocide in Gaza,
Right.
a claim that Israel vehemently denies, of course.
Of course. And this all ties back to the broader issue of regional instability, with Iran backing the Houthis and Russia being a key player in both the Syrian and Yemeni conflicts.
Okay, so let's talk about Russia and its actions a little more. What's been happening in the Baltic Sea recently? It's become a real focal point for tension between Russia and the West.
Definitely has. There's been this suspected sabotage of the S-Link 2, a crucial undersea power cable that connects Finland and Estonia. A Russian oil tanker named Eagle S is at the center of the investigation.
I heard about that.
It's making people nervous, especially since this is the third incident in the Baltic Sea in just the past few weeks involving possible Russian sabotage of underwater cables and pipelines.
Wow.
It's definitely raising the stakes. NATO is boosting its military presence in the region. And Estonia, which is especially vulnerable because of its reliance on these undersea cables for power, has deployed a patrol ship to protect its remaining power link to Finland.
So it feels like we're seeing a return to that Cold War tension, doesn't it?
It does, with Russia flexing its muscles and the West scrambling to respond. But it's not just a simple replay of the Cold War, is it?
Right.
Things are way more complicated now.
For sure.
With the global economy, cyber warfare, and the fact that everything is so interconnected, it's a pretty volatile mix.
It really is. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about a tragedy off the coast of Morocco. A boat carrying around 80 people capsized.
Awful.
And a lot of those on board were fleeing the instability and hardship in Mali, hoping for a better life. At least 69 people died, including 25 Malians. It's a stark reminder of the risks people are willing to take when they feel like they have no other choice.
It is. And the situation in Mali is particularly bleak right now. Years of jihadist violence, political turmoil, and those recent military coups have made things even worse.
Yeah.
It's no wonder people are desperate to leave.
Absolutely. It raises those big questions about how we address the root causes of migration and how we as a global community can provide safe and legal pathways for people seeking asylum. It's a complex issue, no doubt.
Absolutely. And while we grapple with those bigger questions, there are immediate crises unfolding, like what's happening in Gaza.
Right.
The situation there continues to deteriorate, and the Israeli military has now evacuated one of the last working hospitals in northern Gaza, the Kamal Adwan Hospital.
This is deeply troubling. We're talking about a hospital, a place that should be neutral, protected under international law.
Exactly.
The fact that the Israeli military felt they had to evacuate it, citing security concerns, well, it really gives you a sense of how volatile things are in northern Gaza right now.
And the evacuation itself was chaotic and traumatic for everyone involved. Patients and staff had very little warning, and they were forced to move critically ill patients, some of whom were in comas and on ventilators.
Could you imagine the fear and uncertainty for those patients and their families?
Nah.
This hospital was already under a tightening Israeli blockade, struggling to get supplies and aid, and now they've been moved to another hospital that's also been evacuated and is reportedly barely functioning.
It's a humanitarian disaster unfolding, and it's hard to see any easy solutions. The calls for a ceasefire haven't led to anything yet, and the longer this conflict drags on, the more people will suffer.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict. Okay, let's switch gears now and talk about Elon Musk and his social media platform X, formerly known as Twitter. His time at the helm has been, well, let's just say eventful. Lots of controversy, mass layoffs, policy changes that have some people crying censorship and others saying it's led to a spike in hate speech. It's a mess.
Musk has been very vocal about his vision for X. He wants it to be this bastion of free speech, a platform where anyone can say anything. But his critics argue that this approach has just made the platform more toxic and divisive. They say it's become a breeding ground for misinformation and hate speech.
And it's not just the content itself. There's a growing sense that the algorithms that control what people see on X are now prioritizing engagement above everything else, even accuracy. So the more outrageous something is, the more likely it is to get attention. And that just feeds this whole cycle of polarization.
You're right. And that kind of online environment has real-world consequences. We're seeing a rise in online harassment and abuse, and X is being used more and more to spread disinformation and propaganda. It's worrying.
And then there's the whole thing with Musk and Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah.
Their close relationship. And the fact that Musk has even offered Trump a role on his new advisory team, which he's calling the Department of Government Efficiency.
Yeah, that's raising eyebrows. It makes people wonder about potential conflicts of interest and how the lines between social media and political influence are getting blurred. We can't forget how powerful these social media platforms are.
Right.
They can shape public opinion and even influence elections.
It's not a stretch to say that social media has been weaponized in the past to spread disinformation and create chaos.
Yeah.
And now you've got the owner of one of the biggest social media platforms aligning himself with a figure as controversial as Trump.
Yeah.
It's a recipe for trouble, in my opinion.
It's a situation that needs to be watched closely, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to another area that's been in the headlines a lot lately, cryptocurrency. It's been a rough year for crypto, with all sorts of scandals and collapses. And the latest development involves the extradition of South Korean crypto entrepreneur Do Kwon to the United States.
Right. This guy was basically on the run for months after the collapse of those two digital tokens he created, Terra USD and Luna. That whole thing wiped out billions of dollars in investor funds and really shook the crypto world. It showed just how risky and volatile this whole space can be.
It did. Those tokens were supposed to be stable coins. Their value is meant to be pegged to something stable, like the US dollar. But obviously that didn't work out so well, and the whole thing imploded, taking a bunch of other cryptocurrencies down with it.
It was like a domino effect. And now, K1 is finally facing the music, being extradited to the U.S. to stand trial on charges related to the whole debacle.
It's a win for regulators and for investors who lost a lot of money. It sends the message that even in the wild west of crypto, there are consequences for fraud and reckless behavior.
Let's hope this case leads to some much-needed reform in the crypto world, stronger regulations and better protections for investors.
Fingers crossed. Okay, shifting gears to a story that hits closer to home, here in the U.S. There's been a horrific crime in New York City. A man has been charged with murder and arson after a woman was set on fire on a subway train.
It's a truly disturbing story. The victim was reportedly asleep on the train when the suspect approached her and set her clothes on fire. It's a senseless act of violence that has really shaken the city.
It's a tragedy. The subway is supposed to be a safe and reliable way to get around, but incidents like this really erode public trust and make people feel unsafe.
The suspect, Sebastian Zepeda, is being held without bail and is facing very serious charges. And while it's important to let the justice system run its course, this case also raises those tough questions about public safety, mental health services, and how we support people who are struggling.
We've seen an increase in these seemingly random acts of violence in recent years, both in the U.S. and globally.
It's true.
It's a complex issue, but we need to be talking about the root causes of this violence and working to create a safer society for everyone.
It's going to take a multifaceted approach. Law enforcement, mental health professionals, community leaders, and just regular people, all working together.
We need to foster a culture of empathy and understanding. That's where it starts.
Yeah, it's about building a society where, everyone feels seen and heard, supported. Anyway, let's move on. There's a story that raises some concerns about press freedom and how foreign nationals are treated in Iran.
Okay.
An Italian journalist, Cecilia Sala, has been arrested in Iran.
Oh, wow.
And she's currently being held in solitary confinement at Evin Prison in Tehran.
That's terrible.
The details surrounding her arrest are pretty murky, to be honest.
Really?
She had a valid journalist visa and was in Iran conducting interviews for her podcast.
So what happened?
It's a worrying sign, Iran has a history of detaining foreign nationals, sometimes on what seem like trumped-up charges and using them as bargaining chips in diplomatic negotiations.
It's scary to think about. It is. But Italy is pushing hard for her immediate release and is working behind the scenes with Iranian authorities to try and, figure out what's going on legally.
I see.
It's a delicate situation, and it's unclear how it's going to play out.
Let's hope for a swift and just resolution for Cecilia. Okay, switching gears back to the U.S., there are some interesting things happening within the Republican Party, especially when it comes to immigration.
Yeah, there's this internal debate brewing over the H-1B visa program.
Oh, right.
The program that allows U.S. companies to hire skilled workers from other countries. It's exposing some fault lines within the Republican coalition.
Interesting. How so?
Well, on one side, you've got people like Vivek Ramaswamy. He's been tapped by Trump to, slash government spending.
Yeah.
He's arguing that the H-1B program is good for the U.S. economy and that America, as a culture needs to focus more on excellence and less on mediocrity.
Oh, I see.
And then on the other side, you have the more traditional Republicans, folks like Nikki Haley and some of those far-right influencers who are just dead set against immigration, period.
Right.
They say that the H-1B program just drives down wages for American workers and that the priority should be American jobs first and foremost.
So this debate has been simmering for ages, but now, with Trump about to take office, it's really coming to a head.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how he navigates this issue, trying to keep his base happy while also acknowledging the realities of a global economy.
He's got a tough balancing act ahead of him for sure. And the tech industry, which relies heavily on the H-1B program to bring in talent, will be watching this all very closely. Speaking of the tech industry, Boeing is still trying to dig itself out of a hole after a string of crises. The ones that have really hurt its reputation and its bottom line.
Yeah, it's been a rough few years for the aerospace giant. They've been hit by that safety and quality control crisis, costly worker strike, and problems with their space program. It's been one thing after another.
And there's still this lingering criticism of Boeing's corporate culture, with some people saying they prioritize profits over safety.
Right.
Which brings to mind those tragic 737 MAX crashes a few years back.
It's true. Those crashes revealed serious flaws in Boeing's design and production processes.
Absolutely.
They've made changes since then, but they're still working to rebuild trust with regulators, airlines, and of course the flying public.
That recent strike, which dragged on for 7 weeks and cost Boeing billions, was a major setback. It's going to be a long road back for them.
No doubt. Okay, let's end on a note of hope. Even amidst the ongoing conflict in Sudan, the first aid convoy since the civil war broke out back in April has finally made it to the capital, Khartoum.
That's huge. Sudan has been teetering on the brink of famine. With millions of people in desperate need of food and medical supplies, the fighting between the army and the rapid support forces has made it almost impossible to get aid to those who need it most.
So how did they manage to get this convoy through?
It took months of intense negotiations involving UN agencies, Sudanese community groups, and incredibly, the warring factions themselves.
It's a testament to the tireless work of all those who are committed to alleviating suffering in Sudan. And the glimmer of hope in what has been an incredibly bleak situation.
Let's hope it's the first of many convoys to come. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are people working to make a difference. It really is. That's a good reminder. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about Syria. We've got a couple stories there. Right?
All right, let's dive into those.
So first off, you know how the Syrian conflict has had all these regional implications.
Right.
Well, we're seeing that play out with the Houthis in Yemen.
Okay, remind me. Who are they again?
So the Houthis are this group that control northwestern Yemen. And for a while now, they've been launching missiles and drones at Israel.
Oh, right. I remember that.
And Israel, of course, has retaliated with airstrikes, hitting targets in Yemen, like the international airport in Sana'a and some ports on the Red Sea coast.
So things are escalating.
Definitely. And there's a lot of international concern about it, especially the potential impact on humanitarian operations in Yemen.
Yeah, Yemen's already in a really bad situation, right?
It is. It's a dire situation. Now, the Houthis are saying they won't stop the attacks until Israel stops what they call the genocide in Gaza. But Israel vehemently denies any accusations of genocide, of course.
Right. Okay, so what else is going on in Syria?
Well, the civil war there had a huge impact. Even though Assad fell from power back in 2011, there are still a lot of after effects.
How so?
Well, for one, there's the emotional trauma. People are finally feeling safe enough to share their stories.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. There's this woman, Duna Haj Ahmed. She's a Syrian refugee living in London now. And she just recently found out what her husband went through in one of those notorious Syrian prisons.
Oh, wow. Which one?
Al-Khatib in Damascus.
I've heard of that. Wasn't that place, really bad?
It was awful. Her husband, Abdullah al-Nafal, was detained there, and the conditions were horrific. Solitary confinement, beatings, constant fear of torture.
I can't even imagine.
And his story is, sadly not unique. There was that trial in Germany a few years back. Anwar Raslan, the Syrian official.
Yeah, I remember that.
That case really showed the world what was going on in these prisons. Systematic torture, tens of thousands killed. It's just, it's really hard to wrap your head around.
It is. So I guess what you're saying is, even though the war is over, the scars are still very much there.
Absolutely. It's going to take a long time for Syria to heal. And that's just one piece of the puzzle. There are so many other factors at play in the region.
Like what?
Well, we've talked about Russia's involvement in Yemen, right? But they're also a key player in Syria, and their influence extends beyond the Middle East.
Like where else?
Well, take Georgia, for example. The country we were talking about earlier.
The sanctions and the political crisis.
Exactly. Some people say that Russia is trying to destabilize Georgia, to keep it from getting closer to the West.
It's a complex situation for sure.
Yeah.
Lots of moving parts.
It is, and that's what makes it so important to stay informed, to connect the dots and try to understand the bigger picture.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of that today. We've covered a lot of ground, from the Caucasus to the Middle East to the Baltic Sea and everything in between.
We have. It's been a whirlwind tour of global events, that's for sure.
But hey, That's the world we live in. It's constantly changing, and staying informed is the best way to navigate it.
I agree. So, till next time, stay curious, stay informed, and let's hope for a more peaceful future.
Sounds good to me. Thanks for joining us, everyone.